Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
If you had $1,850, Emily, what would you spend it on?
My first thought is 2 pairs of Christian Louboutin shoes or a plane ticket.
Oh, that was my first thought too. Actually, I think maybe like a new paddleboard would be cool. Maybe a new bicycle. Well, it's a fair amount of money, but you know what else you could spend it on? 1 hour of David Boies' time, the lawyer. 1 hour. And David Boies, a very famous name for many reasons, maybe infamous at this point. And the reason I bring it up and what we wanted to talk about today was Ascend Wellness and some other leading cannabis businesses banding together to sue the federal government over what they believe to be unconstitutional policies that are impending their operations. And they're using David Boies' firm, David Boies, Schiller Flexner. Pretty fascinating stuff.
Pretty fascinating. So, do you want to hear a little backstory about how we got engaged with David?
I do.
Yeah. Okay. So, a lot of you know that I work with the Ascend team pretty closely. I'm on the board, and I had been the chair of this group called Capital Markets group at this group called Attach. And Attach does a lot of work on behalf of the industry. They're kind of they have a groundswell building behind them. And in our capital markets effort, we've been trying to help with a group of lawyers to inform the exchanges that in fact they can work with plant touching US operators. And at the Benzinga conference in April, I made some introductions from some of the MSOs, including Abner Curtin from Ascend, to the Attach team. And I just remember, I do my best to make connections and then wait to hear how people take them. And on the backside of that connection came a very fired up CEO and team, because what they had done is they'd heard the Attach team and then started to actually extrapolate that and take it even a step further to where we are today. And, they had reached out to David Boies' team and the firm there. And what was interesting is that they had been keeping an eye on something like this. So it was like Tinder, with a match to Tinder, the whole thing ignited. So I will let Sai give some of the backstory on this, but that's a little bit of how we started this immediate movement.
Yeah, so when I first saw this headline, and it's an incredible headline, this idea of going this judiciary route to some federal changes, I really wanted to dig in and understand, where this is coming from, what this means, what are the things that are unconstitutional here that we're looking to change. So I thought I'd give the listeners a bit of a primer, and I'm not a lawyer, although I do play one on television, so I will do my best to to articulate this. And it all starts with the Commerce Clause. And so the Commerce Clause allows laws passed by the federal government to override state laws that affect interstate commerce. And I think this came from long ago, the beginning of the Confederation, and where states were imposing tariffs, and it was kind of pulling the whole union apart early on, right? This is like the 1700s, the beginning of the U.S. There's another part of this clause, and we'll get to this and what this means maybe later on, but there's this dormant Commerce Clause, which automatically invalidates protectionist state laws. So if a state is trying to do something that maybe protects a certain aspect of their internal state business for financial gain, that stuff's unconstitutional immediately, right? So the Dormant Commerce Clause covers that and shuts that down. So it's all complex, but essentially states can't, introduce things that cause undue burden or discrimination in favor of their own economic interests. And there's all sorts of tests to account for that. So going from there, the Commerce Clause, right? The federal government needs to kind of regulate interstate because they want to make sure that all the states get along. And so back in 1942, there was this court case, Wickard versus Filburn, in which the court upheld Congress's power under this Agriculture Adjustment Act of 1938. So this is way back. And it was really around a quota on wheat. So you could grow a certain amount of wheat for like personal consumption. And this guy Filburn was a small farmer in Ohio, and he harvested about 12 acres of wheat, which above his allotment that he was allowed under this act of 1938. And he was penalized under the act. And he argued that the extra wheat was really produced for his own use and thus had no effect on interstate commerce. He's like, so what? I made a little more. It's not going to impact, the state next door. But the court actually found that while personal growth and consumption of wheat might not by itself directly affect commerce, the cumulative impact of individual conduct aggregated amongst many farmers would actually affect the price. And I guess they're really sensitive about price of wheat back in 1942, and probably still today. And so it's this idea of like one guy with 12 extra acres, no big deal. But every farmer in the state with 12 extra acres now starts to impact that. So hold this thought, because this kind of comes back to our world. So this Commerce Act, I know we're talking about kind of using it and invalidating some of these federal challenges around cannabis, but it can be used for good too. In 1964, it was like the foundation of the Civil Rights Act, because the federal government had to use the Commerce Act to enact the Civil Rights Act, because it's really hard for the federal government to go in and say change all these rules, but they use the commerce power to do that. And so the section that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race in places of public accommodation, such as restaurants and hotels. So they were saying like, you cannot discriminate because that's going to impact interstate commerce, right? And they even went as far as like the small restaurants that were like, we only serve our little community, we can choose who we serve. And they're like, no, you buy your food from elsewhere and all of that. So you are impacting that. But it hasn't been like a free-for-all forever and doesn't work for everything. There was a challenge in 1995 in relation to the Gun-Free Zone Act, which is when the federal government tried to institute this like gun-free zone thing. And it's terrible timing with all the latest news. But back in 1995, some student went to school with a gun in Texas, a small gun, and was caught and then was tried under this. And then the Supreme Court ultimately found against the government using the Commerce Clause to enact the Gun-Free Zone Act. So the Supreme Court said, look, there's no economic impact here to interstate commerce. You can't use that, which seems like a stretch, right? But the government argued things like there's a lot of insurance costs associated with violent crime, and that impacts states. Economy is harmed when individuals are harmed, right? And these are all legitimate things, I think. But they ultimately said, no, Commerce Clause doesn't work, didn't hold up in court, which brings me now to cannabis, right? So tying it all back as best I can. You still with me?
I'm here.
Okay. So Gonzalez versus Gonzalez versus, I believe it's pronounced Raich. I'm not sure. Raich, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. So back in 1996. Forever ago in California, cannabis was legalized for medical use, but it conflicted with the Controlled Substances Act, which we all know is why cannabis is on the Schedule 1 and why we want to get it descheduled, yada yada. So during this time, the DEA ended up seizing plants from a patient and saying, look, this is controlled substances, you can't do that, right? They argued, look, it's for personal growth, personal consumption, this should be okay. In the end, the Supreme Court opinion came out that the majority argued Congress could ban local marijuana use because it was part of a class of activities, quote unquote, the national marijuana market. Local use affected supply and demand in the national marijuana market, making the regulation of intrastate inside of California at the time use essential to regulating the drug's national market. And the opinion actually pointed back to our wheat farmer friend, right? And said, look, just like this wheat farmer back in 1942, if you get a bunch of people doing home grow and they say cannabis is a commodity in this opinion, and they say that no one can tell the difference between what's grown at home and what's in the illicit market, as such, it's going to impact pricing in the illicit market, which is wild to think that they're worried about pricing the illicit market, but they're ultimately worried about the illicit market and using this to shut that down. And so more recently, in 2021, Justice Thomas revisited Gonzalez. And I don't know if you remember this headline. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but I remember seeing that. It's like nice to hear them talking about it. But he mentioned that the reasoning in the Gonzalez case was predicated upon the need to prohibit interstate trafficking of marijuana to avoid a gaping hole in Congress's closed regulatory system prohibiting interstate trafficking of marijuana. He observed that the federal government's modern practice of turning a blind eye towards possession in the 36 states that have legalized it, therefore undercut the reasoning in Gonzalez, suggesting that Gonzalez should be revisited. So the whole premise of why they made that decision, even though it's kind of based on the wheat farmer, since then, 36 states have legalized in some form, right? And he's saying, and they still haven't done anything, so we need to revisit this. And back to that dormant clause and how this impacts that, I think that long term, when we do talk about federal change, that dormant clause is going to go into effect. And you're going to have all sorts of states or people suing states saying, hey, you're giving favorite nation status to these farmers that are in this state or whatever. It's got to be a level playing field. And if Congress doesn't get in front of this whole thing, it's going to be a giant mess. And apparently with alcohol, there have been like hundreds and hundreds of cases argued over this. So it's like, now's the time to fix this. So back into Ascend and how this fits in, they're really challenging this idea on pricing, and that it matters because you're talking about a home grower, in these tightly regulated markets that operators like Ascend are operating in, that pricing won't be so impacted by, this kind of issue is fundamentally what they're trying to argue. Obviously, a lawyer that will charge $1,850 will argue it much better than I am right now. But I think that's the gist of what they're trying to do here. And, at Headset, when we see pricing data and we see markets come online, like New Jersey recently, and you don't see pricing change in California, you don't see pricing change in Pennsylvania. And that's because they are tightly regulated and controlled. And so, that's one data point towards this. But that's the background. That's how we got here. And I think that's how this whole thing ties together.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of other instances that point to a broader concept around it, which is what we deal with at the federal level versus what the states are allowed to regulate and control. And that was another aspect of what got the team very fired up, is realizing that we do have precedents around this. In some instances, I'm kind of happy about it. In others, I'm not so happy about it. And I think you did a really interesting job of articulating how these things kind of cut a few ways when it depends on the issue and how the issue impacts society. But I think we've all seen from the data coming out of the states that have legalized and regulated cannabis that it's a net positive impact on society in many regards. And so including even just a decline in opiate addiction in the markets where it's legal. But, other things that have set a bit of precedent are indicating that this Supreme Court, and when we can talk about politicized or not, is a little bit more interested in seeing states being able to regulate their own frameworks around it, and that being upheld and honored by our federal government. And I know Abner is pretty pumped up when digging in more on the DraftKings suit. And that was something that was really important. It allowed for, gambling to be regulated at the state level and not interfered with by the federal government. And that's very much a lot of the things of what they're looking at with this. And I mean, right now, we're in a real-time moment where Roe versus Wade is sitting in the crosshairs of this exact discourse. And so I think it's kind of an interesting moment in time. I think in another Supreme Court lineup, it may not be something that the Ascend and the other MSOs that are looking to get involved would even pursue. But because there are indications, and to your exact point about the opinion that came out last year, was it 2021 technically?
Yeah, 21.
Yeah. I think these are kind of like directional indicators that this could get heard, because there have been other things that have gone to the Supreme Court and have not been heard. And so it's a process for sure, but it's exciting to think about an alternative pathway. Should we kind of run down that road a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So what does that look like? I mean, timing wise?
Yeah. So it looks like, right now the team that's working on this, including Attach, is still involved. They're trying to make sure they, get enough support from some of the other operators. Because as you pointed out, this is not for the frugal or for the, those who are concerned about spending, because it's an investment, and it's an investment in the potential for improving on what this looks like in the United States. And, I think you can invest into trying to improve how things operate around cannabis a few ways. One, you can support politicians through, supporting their campaigns. I think this is a different way of supporting it by taking this legal action approach and going through the judicial branch. So we're looking at probably 2 to 3 months to get, the MSOs that we think are on board, and maybe even some other non-MSOs, but people who have an interest in this as well, to help support this and come together as a unified front. And it sounds like there is definite interest from some other groups as well. I think we've heard that Curaleaf is interested. We've heard maybe TerraSend, but I don't want to speak out of turn on that. It's just some things I'm hearing around the water cooler of the cannabis industry. The case will probably take about 2 to 3 years, right? So I've seen some feedback on Twitter and just broadly around this, that 2 to 3 years, that feels like so long. But I think the way that we are thinking about this is that we all know what has gone on with the SAFE Act. We all know that this is being heavily politicized as an issue. Now, Bill Maher this week talked about how the Republicans are going to, quote unquote, steal this issue from the Democrats. And the way that we've all been thinking about it is this is all broken. The system is broken around this in terms of the legislative branch getting something done. So why not take a different path. It's like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different outcome. So why shouldn't we take a different path? And that's why I'm pretty invigorated by running down this road and pursuing this path with SCOTUS.
Me too. And 2 to 3 years of work for a Supreme Court case sounds like a lot of billable hours. So I'm sure the more, the merrier, but definitely looking forward to seeing how this pans out.
Yeah. And I think that there's also a sense that if the politicians in the legislative branch start to feel as though they're losing grasp of this issue, then maybe they'll move more quickly, because if they think they're going to get worked around on it, maybe they'll dive in more earnestly on getting things done.
Let's hope so. And there's always the wheat industry they can go after.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.